for us, if we took Scripture seriously, if we took what Jesus said seriously, scriptures like Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was ill and in prison and you visited me, and so forth. When you think of, oh, that's a nice things to do. But when you think about, every person in need that you meet is Jesus Christ. And our salvation is bound up with how we treat that person. That's the radical message. That's a radical message, that every person, this hits me, somebody who, takes her seriously and takes Jesus seriously. Every time I go into New York and I go to Penn Station and I get hit up for money from people and they're obviously in need, that just rings in my ears. And sometimes it stings in my ears because I gotta get to work, Dorothy Day responded to people with a philosophy that I guess ended up being called personalism, that you really treat every person with a deep, abiding respect. And as Christian, you treat them as Jesus Christ. And other scriptures, the blessed are the peacemakers. In the Great Depression, she focused on poverty and workers' rights. And then as World War II went on, she opposed World War II, and the movement opposed World War II, and the circulation tanked, and a lot of guys left the houses and enlisted. They thought, no, we need to stop Hitler. We need to go to war. She said, no, war is always wrong. And she stuck with that. Blessed are the peacemakers, and was a peacemaker until her death in 1980. So that kind of, when you say that radical devotion, that radical devotion is a devotion to the teachings of Jesus Christ and a devotion to that person in need that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 25.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned like World War II and the Great Depression, but early on in her life, there was also kind of like two disasters that sort of shaped her direction, which was, first of all, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which happened when she was very young. And then later on, the flu epidemic, which happened when she was a young woman. So I was just wondering, I would love to hear you talk about how these events helped her find her purpose and what we can learn from her response to these events, like as we're in this monumental crisis ourselves right now.
That's a great question. I'm going to start by sharing an image from the Dorothy Day graphic biography I'm working on. And this is the San Francisco earthquake. And of course, there's a few pages before this, but it started, people noticed that something was wrong when the cathedral in San Francisco, which is in Chinatown, the bells started ringing. So, kind of imagine you're just waking up. It's 5:18 or something in the morning, and you're just waking up, and there's church bells ringing. And then you think, oh, wonder why church bells are ringing. And then all of a sudden, that devastation you see at the top left happens. The earth opens up. I mean, it's pretty intense. Dorothy is with her family in Oakland. She's about 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and her father's a sports writer. He works for the San Francisco paper, and they live in Oakland. And suddenly, the ground shakes. Her parents wake up, and her father says, "I'll get the boys," and then her mother says, "I'll take the baby and go outside." And they run outside, and they leave Dorothy in the house. I mean, imagine an earthquake's happening. Your parents grab everybody else and leave the house, and there she is, "Mother." This is, I think, and I haven't read a lot of other people saying this, but I think that this was a key moment in her life for two reasons. One of which people talk about, which is her mother's involvement in the response to the earthquake. But, you know, is it a surprise that a person who got left in the house when the earthquake happened would grow up into a person who cares for the people left out of society? For me, that always just seemed like an amazing thing. And I'll just quickly show I'm gonna do this again. This one, this is let's see if we can make this a little bigger. Slideshow. Okay. So, and I hope you can see this okay, but an interesting thing happened. In San Francisco, people got up earlier than they did in Oakland. Now, we think, well, big deal. What would that have to do with a different experience? Well, you know, in the olden days, everybody lit their fires, right, for their heaters in their house. You know, wood stoves, fireplaces, that kind of thing. They lit them around 5 in the morning. Earthquake happens 5:15, and the whole town burns down pretty much. I mean, the earthquake was devastating, but the fires were worse. So San Francisco burns down. Thousands of people go by ferries and across bridges and so forth over to Oakland. And so the people of Oakland who had less damage rose to the occasion. And what Dorothy saw was unions and churches responding to the needs of the people. And that stuck with her forever. She didn't see the government helping people. She saw unions and churches. And she saw all of the things you see in this picture. There's, you know, it may be hard to read the letters there, but there is every one of what's called the corporal works of mercy that she saw, you know, burying the dead, housing the homeless, giving clothes to the naked, medicine for the sick, and so forth, food for the hungry. And so Dorothy saw in her mother's participation in this a way in which we can help our fellow human beings in times of crisis. And again, she saw unions and churches doing that, and that stayed with her forever. And you see that in her antipathy towards the government. This movement, the Catholic Worker that she started, opposed Social Security. Why? Because churches and unions should be taking care of people, not the government. I mean, her whole life, she railed against the government. And, you know, her first arrest, as John mentioned, was as a suffragist, but she really went to this rally because a friend of hers was going. And then suddenly they're arrested and they go on hunger strike, and she's on a hunger strike. Imagine that. You go with a friend to a rally and then you're on hunger strike, you know. And she recalls, you know, that she's, you know, crying in prison because she's hungry and she's reading the Psalms. She wasn't that religious, but they gave her a Bible, the only thing to read. And, you know, she says, this isn't even my issue, you know. And then she never voted her whole life. That's how much she thought government would help people. She didn't even vote. But what she was about was gathering people together, unions and churches, to help people just like they did back in the San Francisco earthquake. Now, the pandemic of 100 years ago has gotten renewed attention. It was kind of a lost part of Dorothy Day's life for a while, but it's been kind of reclaimed that she was hanging out. You know, people familiar with Eugene O'Neill? The name ring a bell? At least some heads are nodding. Some folks, he was one of the great playwrights of American history, and seems to me to be something of an alcoholic and kind of a jerk, but he was a great playwright. And Dorothy and he struck up a friendship, and we're only done with chapter 1 and chapter 2. There's the suffrage thing, and they get beaten. Women get beaten by uniformed and ununiformed men. This is awful. But she meets Eugene O'Neill in this haunt that a lot of the Greenwich Village arty types would go to, they called the Hell Hole. That was the nickname. It was called the Golden Swan, but it had a back room that everybody called the Hell Hole. And so Dorothy would drink until late in the night with her friends and talk about big ideas. And back then, like, they didn't have a lot of entertainment, the kind of entertainment we have today. So people would these were really arty people that were actors, playwrights, poets. And so they would perform for each other. And Eugene O'Neill used to read this poem called The Hound of Heaven, which some people may have read before, but it's about being pursued and chased by God, even though you don't want to be in relationship with God. God still chases you like a dog, chasing prey. And so Eugene O'Neill read this poem, and it really affected Dorothy. And so they began a friendship, which was not romantic, but they were good friends. And just to kind of come to the pandemic part of it, there was a friend of Dorothy's who was the brother of the owner, who committed suicide at the bar. He just drank heroin. I didn't know you could drink heroin. And he drank heroin and died in her arms. And everybody ran and disappeared except for the sister. Now think about it. These are people who come together, who talk about building a better world every night and drinking together. And then one of their own dies and they all run. Even Gene O'Neill runs, and he went to high school with the guy. And that was very traumatic for Dorothy, not just because a friend of hers died in her arms, but also because everybody ran. And she really left that scene entirely. And meanwhile, people were dying from World War I. They were dying from the so-called Spanish flu. And she said, I want to be of use, so I'll become a nurse. And so that's how she became a nurse during the pandemic. And Kings County Hospital was where she worked for about a year.
So I think also one of the interesting things about Dorothy Day is that, I mean, you just mentioned all of these monumental events that she was on the front lines of. And even after going through all of this, there are sort of these moments like the earthquake and the pandemic and her friend dying in her arms that were pushing her towards faith. But she really wasn't a Catholic until she was around 30 years old. So can you talk a little bit about what sparked that for her?
Yeah, it was really gratitude. She had always been, she was, we could spend a whole hour talking about just the radical scene of the old left back in the teens, and these newspapers like The Call and the masses that she worked with. But she was a good journalist. She worked for these radical papers. If you've ever seen the movie Reds, and if you haven't, you should rent it. It's about that whole group, and she was friends with all those people. It's an excellent, excellent movie. She was involved with a journalist, another radical journalist. His name was Lionel, and she became pregnant. And she talked to him about it, and he said, it's me or the baby. You need to get rid of it. And he gave her a choice. She could have the baby and they would break up, or he would stay with her and she'd have an abortion. She had the abortion, and it was actually Emma Goldman's boyfriend who performed the abortion. He was a well-known hobo doctor. Yeah, you see this kind of like Forrest Gump kind of thing of like being there and everything. And so he performed the abortion, and there were complications which were very painful and traumatic for Dorothy. And she had a lot of trauma after this, and tried to kill herself a couple of times. And so it's a very dark period. In her memoir, The Long Loneliness, she has this line in there of like this 3-year period. She says, of these years, there's not much to say. She tries to commit suicide twice and, has this abortion. I mean, there's a lot to say about it, but she didn't want to. It was very, very painful. So she moves on. She writes a novel. It's kind of the tell-all novel about it's like a Taylor Swift song about, a boyfriend, like she writes this novel about Lionel that's slightly fictionalized, and it has decent sales, and Hollywood options it, and pays her $5,000, which at the time was a lot of money. And her best friend says, Dorothy, I've seen you spend money. You got to buy a little house with this or something, because you're just going to waste this. It's not going to last. So she buys a little cottage on Staten Island, and there's a whole, it's like with Eugene O'Neill, there's this whole literary scene on Staten Island. It's almost like Provincetown on Cape Cod. It's a really arty little town. And she falls in love with a guy there. His name is Forster. And he's an actor, and he's really into nature, and he teaches her about the sea, and it's very, very romantic time. They fall in love. She gets pregnant, and she was certain that she'd never be able to have children because of the complications from the abortion. And she feels so full of gratitude to God about everything in her life. She's in love, she's got this child that's coming, and she finally feels like things are coming together, and she feels so grateful to God that she says, I'm going to join a church. And she said, where are the poor? Where do the poor go to church? This is the Catholics. At the time, it's the immigrants, the Italians, and others who are Catholic that she feels drawn to. And so she becomes Catholic. And then her real problem then is that nobody seems to care about the stuff that she does in the Catholic Church. Nobody's talking about worker rights. No one's talking about the poor, at least the people she's talking to. Meanwhile, we have this great Catholic social teaching happening. There's all this great stuff happening, but it's not happening around her. So she has no Catholic friends. She's Catholic for several years. She has no Catholic friends. And she goes to rallies where her friends, many of them are now communists, they're organizing these ways to help people. And she's like, I've left that part of my life, but I feel like I want to give something back to God. What do I do? And that's where she finds herself praying in the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and she prays to God to help give her some guidance, to bring her gifts, to help the poor and to help working people. And she gets on a bus and she comes home, and there's this weird French guy in her apartment who wants to teach her about this movement she and he are going to start.
So first I want to say I'm really glad that you brought up like what she called the long loneliness, because I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. And it's also sort of one of like the remarkable things about her is that we have like documentation of her just feeling all of these emotions that are so human, that so many people feel, like especially right now during a pandemic when everyone is isolated. And I think a lot of saints or even just figures that people look up to often aren't really that relatable. So I just wanted to say that. But then I also want you to I know that where you're talking about now with Peter Morin is the beginning of the Catholic worker movement. So can you talk a little bit about what is it for people who don't know? And I guess what they did then, but also I know they're around now. So what do they do now?
Yeah, sure. Peter Morin was a former brother in a Catholic religious order, and he was a French, he always called himself a French peasant. So I guess they still had French peasants back in those days, but he was a guy who had grown up on the land, you know, farming, and had like this incredible number. I think it's like 18 brothers and sisters. You know, I don't know how that's possible. Oh. That's what the books say. 18 brothers and sisters. So he became this kind of spiritual teacher who would just go around and talk to anybody who would listen to him, teaching them about the saints, about Catholic social teaching, about workers, and he would try to convert communists to become Catholics, and he'd argue in Union Square. I mean, they'd have real soapboxes, right? You know, this is where a lot of that idea comes from. He'd stand on a soapbox and do this. He had this, intense French accent. A lot of people had trouble understanding what he said, but he was so passionate about how faith and helping workers were one. And so a guy, he shows up at Dorothy's house because the editor of a magazine called Commonweal, which is published in New York, told him he really ought to talk to Dorothy Day, because she can't stop talking about this stuff. And that's the thing. Like Dorothy knew what she wanted, and she told people about it. And when she was involved with the radical scene, they used to say, the head of the Communist Party in America said Dorothy Day would make a terrible communist because she can't shut up about religion. They had heard her just constantly talking about her faith, and so that she was looking for something there, and so she found it, but she still kept telling people, there's something missing here. And she would write for Commonweal. She would cover these marches for the Catholic press, and so this editor just kind of played matchmaker, said, well, Peter, you got to talk to Dorothy Day. So he shows up at her apartment. She's gone to Washington to this rally. So he just says, oh, I'll just wait for her. So it's like late in the night. She gets off this bus after this long trip from Washington, and he decides he wants to educate. He says, you know a lot about workers, but you know so little of the faith. You need to learn about Catholic teaching, and you need to learn about the saints, and I'm going to teach you. And she was like, all right, maybe some other time, because I just got back, And he says, okay, we'll start at 9 o'clock tomorrow. And he comes the next day. And so he's kind of in and out of her apartment, and he says, we need to start this movement. We'll have a newspaper. We'll have houses of hospitality that will welcome people. And we'll have farms where people can go to the land. There is no unemployment on the land. That was his thing about, there's this great 25% unemployment in the United States in the Great Depression. He says, there's no unemployment on the land. You can always grow things. He's a farmer, himself. So he really thinks that's the way to go. So he had this like three-pronged idea. So they started with the newspaper. And he tells Dorothy exactly what it's going to be like. It's going to be full of his writings and stuff. And then he goes off to this job he has in upstate New York at this boys' camp. And she says, yeah, I could do a newspaper. She grew up in a newspaper family, right? And then she worked on these newspapers. And, when the censors shut down the masses, the editors gave her instructions how to lay it out and print it if they were in prison, and they all got arrested, and she published the last issue. And the only reason she didn't get arrested was because she was new to the staff, and so she wasn't listed on the editor's list. But Peter Morin said, let's start this movement, and let's start with a newspaper. So she does this newspaper and includes a couple articles of his, but kind of does it her way. And he comes back and he's really pissed off because he had this idea that it was just going to be all his writings in the thing, you know. And so she says, Peter, no, we're not going to do that. We're gonna do a lot of stuff. And he's like, well, then take me off I'm not going to be an editor anymore, you know. So it takes a while. But he cools off and then comes down, comes back. And one day, some people show up and say, I hear you have these houses of hospitality. Can we stay tonight? You know, and Peter's a theorist. So he's just putting this all out there in the paper. But Dorothy is very practical. And she's like, there are people in front of us who are cold, who don't have a place to stay. Well, why don't we put them in this extra room in our house? And so some people stay over. And then they find out that the barbershop below their apartment is for rent. And so they rent the barbershop and they turn that into what we would call a shelter today. That was the first house of hospitality. So it started with a paper, but then people in need held them accountable to the values that were in the paper. So it's kind of interesting that way, that it's not a bunch of do-gooders who opened up a shelter. You know, it's some people with big ideas who were held accountable to their ideas. And that's how the Catholic Worker got started. And, you know, true to her kind of anarchist approach, you know, Dorothy was always much, in fact, Cardinal Dolan one time got this question, you know, somebody stood up at, you know, one of these talks about Dorothy Day and said, wasn't she a communist? And Cardinal Dolan was like, well, really, she was more of an anarchist. You know, and people like, you know, people are laughing about that like it's a joke, you know. But Cardinal Dolan's actually a historian, you know, by his academic trade, so he's actually interested in these nuances. And her anarchism came out in the design of the Catholic Worker. Like even today, anybody who says we got an extra room in our house, let's have people stay there who are in need. And we'll, you know, they can stay with us. Anyone who does that can call it a Catholic Worker House. There is no central office that approves things. The house in New York is just like any other house. There's older houses, an older house in Rochester, New York. I mean, they're not all, you know, they're not all beholden to New York. So it's an anarchist in that sense. So today there are a lot of different ministries that happen. Like, for example, in Europe, the Catholic workers in Europe tell me that the social system is so strong that they have really decided to focus on refugees. The houses of hospitalities are not focused on like alcoholic people who need a place to stay. They're focused on refugees and refugee families. There is in Cleveland a famous one that housed handicapped children, and they have been doing that for many, many years, who get treatment at the hospitals nearby. And there are Catholic worship houses that are mostly prayer. There are farms that you know, will grow stuff and then send it down to the urban areas for the food banks so that they have fresh food. There's really a resurgence of that, actually, part of the kind of the, you know, millennials and then the next generation kind of getting into the idea of farming and organic farming. So there's quite a few of those, and communities of people who come together for those reasons.
I think that's so relevant now, especially because, I mean, just thinking about the number of people who are being evicted right now and losing their jobs. And I just think that her vision of direct action is just almost kind of feels like the opposite of right now. A lot of conversations sort of revolve around electoral politics. And she never really cast a ballot in her life, but she, you know, changed thousands of lives. So I was just wondering, what do you think is the most relevant part of her mission right now? Because for me, that really speaks to me, that vision of direct action and mutual aid, and not necessarily waiting for the government to save you, because it won't, like relying on each other during a time of crisis. But I was wondering, what do you think is most relevant about her vision for right now?
Yeah, it's funny. It's almost what you'd call a parlor game of what would Dorothy say today about blank? And her. If you're looking for a really good book to read about Dorothy, her granddaughter Kate. Now, there's two granddaughters who are in the news a lot. One daughter, Martha, is now in prison for taking part in the Kings Bay Plowshares action, where they, threw blood on nuclear weapons and that kind of thing. So Martha kind of inherited the activist gene, and Kate inherited the writer gene. Kate Hennessy. She was quite an accomplished travel writer for many years, and then she thought, everyone's always told my grandmother's story, but no one's ever told my mother's story. Tamar, the little girl, who was born in the Catholic worker and grew up and, got to, when her mom was, building these houses, lived in them, and, some of the couples that lived there would take care of her and stuff. And so Kate wrote a memoir that was, both a biography of Dorothy, but also from Tamar's point of view in many ways. And I kind of expected, like, I Remember Granny, something like that. But she really put together what is kind of a heartbreaking family memoir of what the Catholic worker movement was as Dorothy was putting it together, like what was really happening. You get kind of the kind of idealized version in The Long Loneliness, and then you get kind of here's what really happened, and it's not terrible or anything, but I'm sorry, the question that Kate got asked when she was talking about her book was, would Dorothy have been at the Women's March? Because the Women's March had like happened like the weekend before, and she said, I don't know about that, but I bet she would have been at Standing Rock. And that experience kind of illustrated two things for me. One is that people will always say, Dorothy would have been doing this, Dorothy would have been doing that about their own issues that they're working on, whether it's true or not. People are always going to do that. I mean, wait till she's made a saint. I mean, that'll really, tip things over. And then the other thing was that Kate nailed it, that the poorest of the poor in our country, Native Americans, who the fact that it's their land, well, when have we paid attention to that before, right? That it's their land, and we're just going to put this pipeline through it. We don't care how it's going to affect, burial, sacred objects. We don't care about that. Dorothy would have been there. I think Kate just really nailed it. It's sort of like with the farm workers. Mm-hmm. She semi-retired in the 1970s. I mean, she used to be a chain smoker. She had an enlarged heart. I mean, in her 70s, she was not in great shape. But something about what Cesar Chavez was doing really came home to her. She was like, here's a man who's devout, he's observant in his Catholicism, he integrates spirituality into his movement, and he is with the poorest of the poor. These are people who are excluded from American labor laws. When you think of the most the worst treated workers in our country, there's this article in the Times about how the state of Washington is doing such a great job containing COVID. Well, I'm talking to people working in farm workers in Yakima County, and they say Yakima County is the second worst county in America for COVID, and it's because the employers don't give people PPE, and they don't let people have days off when they're sick, and so people are showing up at work sick with no protective equipment. That's why it's the second one. So that question of what would Dorothy do here or there is always a tough question, but I think always look for the poorest of the poor. that is where you would find Dorothy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's an amazing place for us to start too, when we're looking for a way to respond to this moment and all of the suffering that comes right now. That's also for us to look for the poorest of the poor as a church, I think is so much of what the Bible calls us to do and what FCC tries to live out. So I can't think of a better way to end this conversation and transition into the questions. So Matthew Baker has a great question. He says he's curious about her proposed sainthood, seeing as she resisted being referred to as a saint during her life. And also adds, insofar as she is being considered for sainthood and not knowing too many saints myself, I can't help but think of Mother Teresa and possible connections there, as well as the theme of motherhood in general, especially in light of her abortion, but also her seemingly endless capacity to care for so many people.
Yeah, I think she might be the first single mom, at least in the modern era, to become a saint, if that happens. But let's start with, don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
you say a sarcastic remark, and it becomes the best known quote that you ever said. You know, Robert Ellsberg, who was my publisher and also the editor of Dorothy's diaries and letters, he said, you know, I have students, because he teaches a few classes, I have college students who don't know who Franklin Roosevelt was, but I mentioned Dorothy Day and they say, oh, didn't she say, don't call me a saint? You know, like it's that well known. I mean, can you imagine that? So yeah, she made a sarcastic remark, which belied her devotion to saints. She was always talking about saints. So I mean, she really, that whole don't want to be dismissed that easily, she was kind of making a sarcastic remark about the whole stained glass kind of thing, or these idealized stories you hear about people who are so unattainable. She used to say to Catherine DeWitt Doherty, who started another movement of helping poor people, Friendship House in Canada, who is also for sainthood. She used to say, leave the saints to their ecstasies, Catherine, let's just take care of people. You know, and so she was like, let's get to the work. Dorothy, one of the things, if you can imagine, she lived about 10 years where the country thought she was a saint, like a living saint. Time magazine did a story on living saints in the early 70s, and Mother Teresa was on the cover, and you open it up and there's Dorothy Day inside. So she's one of the backup singers, you know, of all this. And so so that whole don't call me a saint is complicated. It shows her humility. It showed that she hated being called a saint because there were people who would show up at the Catholic Worker to worship her. You know, she'd be like, stop this, get a mop and start mopping. You know, she did not put up with those people. She did not like people showing up and worshiping her. It really made her upset. And so this whole not wanting to be a saint, it's her humility, and it's also this disgust at the way people would show up. You know, it would even happen in the 30s. People would say, do you have visions? And she'd say, visions of unpaid bills. She's always sarcastic and kind of caustic about this because she hated it. Back to what this process is like. There's 3 stages. There's 4 stages really. The one is becoming a candidate, which Cardinal O'Connor brought her cause to Pope John Paul II and convinced him that, you know, she should be a candidate. So 2000 Pope John Paul made her servant of God. So it's level 1. You know, if he's playing Dungeons and Dragons, you know, she's a first level cleric at that point. So she then the next level is venerable, which I used to thought meant old, but it means worthy of being venerated. So it's like somebody that you would pray to in a church, you know, when you pray to people in official ways. That is what's happening now. And what qualifies a person is their life. And the question for the trial, because it is a trial and it's governed by laws, did she live a life of heroic virtue? And so what I've been doing for the last 6 years is compiling evidence, you know, with teams of people. You know, really the cardinal is the leader of this. And then he has a cardinal's delegate who's kind of my boss in all this. And there are various other characters that I won't go into, but we all work on assembling evidence that's all about discerning, did she live a life of heroic virtue? And you look at what's called the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, you know, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, cardinal virtues, you know, justice, temperance, courage, you know, those kinds of things. The things Paul talks about in the scriptures, it's all based on scripture. So, and did she live them heroically? You know, there's this story, I just tell a quick story. Forster and she split up because he didn't believe in getting married and he was mad at her for becoming Catholic, you know, and he was more agnostic. And he goes on to meet another partner with whom he lives for the next 20 years. You know, they never marry because he didn't like marrying, but they live for 20 years. She gets cancer. He's got a person who's in serious need, you know, that he's living with. He calls up Dorothy and says, you take care of people. Do you think you could take care of my partner? Now imagine this, the guy who wouldn't marry you gets back in touch with you. You know, they've been in touch on and off because they have a child together, but says, can you take care of my partner who I chose over you? And she says, sure. Why don't you move her, rent a cottage in Staten Island near mine, and I'll come every day and I'll take care of her. Okay. Now, is that heroic virtue? I think so.
I think so. That's a very bold way to slide back into the DM. So someone else has a question. How did the church deal with her having an abortion, and was she the recipient of criticism because of that?
Yeah, I mean, even in death, she's a recipient of criticism from nut jobs who spout off on things they know nothing about on the internet. She had the abortion, then she became Catholic. Now, the interesting thing about all that is that the clock starts after your conversion. So, you know, she received the sacrament of reconciliation or confession, became a Catholic, you know, her former sins were washed away, and she was baptized again. She was baptized Episcopal, but she received a new baptism, and her sins were washed away. And so if she had had an abortion after becoming Catholic, yes, it would disqualify her, but it happened before. It does get mentioned by people who, you know, are not really aware of these things. Just like the communist thing. There wasn't even a communist party when she was a radical journalist, and so it's kind of silly to call her communist. So anyway, those things do come up.
Someone else asked, is it a requirement to miraculously heal someone in order to become a saint?
Yeah, venerable is that second stage, and that's, you know, you move forward in that, and then you need 2 miracles, one to become beatified and one to become canonized, to become a saint. And so, yeah, so we've already started collecting potential miracles. I'll just tell you, without revealing anything that I shouldn't, that none of them have impressed me too much. But they're beautiful stories, but they don't strike me as miracles. However, they do show a devotion to Dorothy, meaning that people are praying to her, and anybody can pray to her. And anyone who wants to help the cause now, I say, pray for your needs, pray to Dorothy for your needs, and then let us know if anything miraculous happens. The thing is, it's a trial, and it's actually called a miracle trial, and there's evidence presented, and people argue, and the thing is not that is it possible that this is a miracle, but can you rule out any other cause? And there's just so many things, medically that, maybe this happened, or, I prayed to Dorothy Day and my cancer was cured. Yes, I also did receive chemotherapy. It's like, well, we can't, maybe it was the prayer, but we can't prove it. So.
And I guess we have time for one more question. Jade H says, all I know about Dorothy is from the movie Entertaining Angels. How truthful is the movie's description of her? I haven't seen it. So.
Oh, you have to see it. It's great. Who's that guy who plays Peter Morin? He was in Grace and Frankie, Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen is Peter Morin. And he plays up the comic side of it all. And so it's all true. But some of the Catholic workers don't feel it's reverent enough. And that's the thing, you have a movement that's devoted to a person. They know a lot about her. It's sort of like, when you get any topic where people are kind of obsessive about it, you might be like, like a friend of mine is like, oh no, he didn't play bass on the third album, it was this other guy, So, there's a lot of minutia that the movie doesn't get right. But I thought it was pretty good. I thought they did a really good job. They start when she's older, and that what they show there is very true to life about Dorothy, and then they kind of go back in time, and it's very well done. It covers the founding of the worker to the to kind of a rebellion of the staff. And that's really it's really neat to see how she deals with it.
Cool. So that's another recommendation for everybody. Okay, and this is the last question for real. Did she believe in sin or hell?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. She did, and she did. She's a woman of her times. We haven't gotten into LGBTQIA types of issues, but she was a woman of her times. She had lots of gay friends and colleagues, and was very good to her friends, who were LGBTQIA. And when people would talk about taking positions, she would say things like, some things must never be spoken of. It's really, it's sometimes disappointing in the way many of our elders and social justice movements, if you go back to who they were in the 50s or in the early 60s or something, you kind of leave pretty disappointed that we're affected by the world. And you see, even somebody like James Cone is so wonderful. It was only later in his life that he really, really came around and became a real advocate for LGBTQIA people. So, she definitely believed in sin and hell, and she was very hard on herself, particularly about sin. I don't think she really, she didn't articulate a lot about hell, as a destination or a location on the map, but she certainly talked a lot about sin and a lot about her own sin. I mean, and it wasn't so much, she really didn't talk about the abortion because it was really hard for her, but she did talk about she would lose her temper with people, and she'd be sarcastic too quick, and she'd be really, hold a grudge. And she did lock people out of the Catholic workers for, getting married a second time and things like that without, having an annulment. And she later came to regret that. And we have in her collected letters a few where she's writing to people saying, I was just so severe. And she actually said, I guess, even though she was never a communist, she said, I guess I still had a little of that communist in me. When she says like she took the Catholic teachings too intensely, she said like that's actually a communist kind of behavior. So I thought that was kind of funny. She could laugh at herself, but she was hard on herself. And David Brooks recently said that at a dialogue we had with him over Zoom, that the thing he really felt bad about was how hard she was on herself. Like he thought like she's doing these amazing things and way better than I can do, but she's still really hard on herself. And he was saying, I feel bad for her. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. So
yeah,
thank you so much for all these.
Oh, I was just going to say, I remember reading about how Catholic worker houses were like a huge thing in the 60s during the hippie movement. And she was very stressed about the free love that was going on there.
Yeah, she was. And some of the free love was happening with her grandchildren. And so she was pretty, this was very painful to her. She never said much about rock and roll, but the sex and the drugs really bothered her, But she also was a great inspiration of so many people who are still alive today. And I have to tell you, the highlight for me of working on the sainthood cause is meeting these people. It's almost like, meeting like people who were the deputies to Martin Luther King Jr. Like so many of them have done such amazing things with their lives. They're not Martin Luther King Jr., but they did such amazing things with their lives. And, people like Robert Ellsberg and, Tom Cornell, and there's Monica Cornell, and there's just so many, Pat and Kathleen Jordan, there's so many couples who met at the worker and then had children. And you meet some people who say, yeah, I'm third generation Catholic worker. That they really stuck with it. I mean, not everybody's like that. I have friends who ended up at Catholic Relief Services doing amazing things there, and their parents are really famous Catholic workers. And they said, yeah, that wasn't for me, but I think some of this rubbed off on me. She's like director of Africa for Catholic Relief Services. Yeah, I think so. But it has been great. I had one question for you, Loretta, because I'm always kind of intrigued, and really for any of the other Gen Y, millennials, young folks who are interested in Dorothy Day, like, why? She's a 20th century, she's a woman of another century. She's born in 1897 and died in 1980. So it's a very 20th century life. Why do you care about her in this century?
Honestly, I feel like for me, she really speaks to me as someone who was like a writer and who had like radical ideas and just this creative vision for the world, and like was really just not satisfied with the world as it was, and had an idea of what it could be with people helping each other and elevating each other. And that really speaks to me. I think also definitely the bohemian youth. I feel like that's like something that speaks to a lot of people in my generation, even though it was like 100 years ago. And so many parts about her life. I mean, she lived through a pandemic. I think there's really something in Dorothy's life for everyone, honestly. And thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us about her. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I can't say it enough. I mean, the fact that this conversation happened is just such a dream come true. Really want to thank Loretta and Jeff. Loretta, the way that you guided the conversation, all the pertinent questions that you asked. You are such a professional. So just thank you for everything that you gave. And Jeff, what a wealth of knowledge, such great stories, the comics, the work that you're doing for her sainthood. I think that we've all been so deeply enriched, both by Dorothy Day's humanity and her heroic virtue. We have so much that we can wrestle with, and also that is truly an inspiration for us to live out. So thank you all so much. If everyone wouldn't mind unmuting, and we can give Jeff and Loretta a big round of applause, that would be fantastic.
Hey.
Thank you all.
Well done, well done.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was terrific.
Thank
Real
you.
great.
All right, we'll sign off, but everyone have a great night.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Good everyone.
Good night.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
There we go.